Hey everybody, welcome to Practical Alchemy. On today's episode, I'm going to be teaching you all about embossing and debossing surface elements into your 3D CAD model. This is a very powerful set of techniques. It's really going to allow you to add a lot of complexity and value to your models. So in this tutorial specifically, I'm going to be walking you through two different techniques for creating an emboss and deboss details, and we're going to be talking about the advantages and disadvantages to each, because as with anything in Fusion 360, different modeling techniques will get you to the same place, but there are situational reasons why you should use one technique over the other. So without further ado, let's dive in. As you can see, I've got a demo file here for us to talk through that's got a lot of different scenarios. So I'm going to scrub back through to the beginning of the timeline here and show you what we started with. So if you want to follow along, what I've created is a few different geometric primitives. I've created more of a box shape, which I have then added some fillets to. So we've got some nice tangential edges and smooth corner transitions that we can work with. A cylinder, which is going to give us a very strong curve, and then a more subtle curved surface here as well, just one continuous surface plane. The first tool that we're going to be talking about is the Emboss Tool, as the name implies. And you can see it up here on the Create menu. If I drop down, here is the Emboss Tool. And as it says, it allows you to raise or recess sketch profiles relative to a face on a solid body. Now, that seems pretty self-explanatory, but there's not a lot of details here. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is what not to do. All right. So the first thing that you don't want to do when you create the Emboss Tool is just put a sketch anywhere. So here's what's going to happen here. So as you can see, I've got a text sketch that I've got sitting on the top plane. And if I go ahead and emboss this onto just a random surface, actually, that's not the right one. I'm going to go up here to the Create menu, click on Emboss, and it's going to prompt me for two things, as it said in the tool prompt. A sketch profile that I'm going to use as the projection, and a face to project it on. So let's select our sketch profile. That's what we don't want to do, and our face. And we're going to use this cylinder face here. And as you can see, it says it's created some self-intersecting bodies. That is kind of confusing, but oh, here we go. So if I drag it over a little bit, that seems to help a little bit. And then as I drag it up, it's starting to show up, and it's somewhere, right? And now you can see what not to do, right? You can't just place this sketch anywhere, or the program's not really going to know where to put it, okay? So what we want to do, the first thing that we want to do when we use the Emboss tool, is we want to align our sketch plane to the surface that we are going to project onto. So for example, instead of just projecting randomly on the top plane so that the Fusion is trying to figure out where to put it, what we actually want to do is place our text where we want it. So what I've done here is I have created an offset plane. You can see that right here, that is offset from the XZ plane right there, pressed forward in front of our object, so it's very easy to see. But now when I look at this from the front view, as you can see, this is lined up and it is projecting flat onto that surface. Now, obviously, when we get to the cylinder, that surface isn't going to be flat anymore. But what you can see is if you give it a plane that's very obvious where you're going to put this embossed text, it's going to be much easier to use. So let's jump into our tool again. So go up to the Create menu, hit Emboss, and again, we are going to select our sketch profile, and we are going to select the faces to emboss onto. And as you can see, when I select it, it is automatically going to select the tangent faces to what I am using, because I've got the tangent chain selected here. So I'm going to select this front face, and as you can see, this is a much cleaner representation of where I want this sketch to be. If I look at it from the front plane here, as you can see, it is sitting right where I want it. Now, it's not tied positionally, so I do have the ability to move it around, as you can see. So I can offset it in the horizontal and in the vertical direction from the projection. That is essentially designed so that if it's trying to interpret where your sketch is supposed to go, but it doesn't get it exactly right, you can adjust it at that phase. You can also adjust the rotational angle here. But I'm actually happy with where that is placed, so I'm going to zero that out, and I am going to hit OK. Before I do that, I'm going to show you that this is the depth here, all right? So that is how you are going to set how high that text is embossed off of that surface, and hit OK. All right, great. So what you can see here is that I've got this text that I wrote out as a sketch, and it is now embossed onto this face, or this set of faces that are tangent to each other. So I've got this really cool raised look, and that is the basics of an emboss. All right, so now that we understand the basics of how the tool works on a fairly flat surface, I want to jump over to the cylinder here to give you a better understanding of what exactly Fusion is doing. So what I've done is I've created another sketch here that is going to sit in front of my cylinder. Before we do that, one thing I want to point out is that I do have some control over the placement of this text. So for example, if I drop a line from the midpoint of this text box down to the origin and set that as vertical, that's going to give me a lot of confidence in terms of understanding where this sketch is going to be projected to. But then as I jump forward into my emboss feature, all right, and I'm going to look at this from the front face again, as you can see, the S and the E, which are very close to that center point being projected straight, are very much aligned. And as you can see, there's going to be a lot more divergence, we're over here in the E, from the original sketch. And that's going to explain how this is actually working. I want you to think about this cylinder like a soup can. And imagine that this face here is the label of our soup can. If we were to unwrap that surface, stamp our embossing into that label, and then reapply it, that's essentially what Fusion is doing here. It's taking a flat object and it is embossing it, and then it's rolling it out. Not exactly how the program works per se, but that's essentially what is happening here. All right, so next we're going to jump over to our curve wall, and I want to explain a little bit more about the emboss feature. Now, while the emboss feature is named the emboss, it actually incorporates two different functions, an emboss and a deboss. So what's the difference? Well, an emboss is raised up from our target plane, and a deboss is pressed down into our target plane. And it's actually really easy to do that inside of the tool. So for example, if I go up here to edit feature, go back into this emboss, what you can see is under the effect here, I have the option to emboss it or deboss. All right, so even though the feature is called the Emboss Tool, it actually allows you to do both embossing and debossing here. All right, hit OK. Now that we understand all the basics of the tool and how it works, why should we use the Emboss Tool? There are a few different things that it's really good for. Number one, obviously, is text on a curved surface. It's a great tool for that if you're trying to wrap text around the base of a cylinder or on a curved plane. Really awesome for that. But it's not just for text. I can actually use the Emboss feature to do some freeform decorative elements as well. Really, any type of sketch can be applied in this manner. And what you can see, I'm just going to take this sketch here and project it. Really good for doing some more complicated kind of freeform surface details and things like that. This is a great tool if you've got some complex or organic shapes that you're trying to project onto a surface. All right, let's go ahead and move on. It's also really good for doing things like grip lines. So for example, I've got a sketch here and I've got it laid out onto my cylinder. There's some overlap, and you can see here that I've taken that sketch and I've embossed it onto the surface. And now when you look at it, it's actually got some pretty cool looking grip lines or vents that I've created there. I haven't really constrained this surface, so I can do some really interesting things here as well as I start to wrap these even farther. All right, you can see I could do like more of a volume kind of thing, or a waveform or a pattern, all kinds of stuff. It's also really great for doing some complex geometry and fall off on our surface. So for example, I've got another sketch here. I've got a cool looking trapezoid pattern that's going to come up. And as you can see, because all these surfaces are tangent to each other, it's going to actually wrap around this corner. So that gives me kind of a really cool surface detail or an offset that would be somewhat difficult to create using a different methodology. So really good for adding details to your surface, adding visual interest, adding text, obviously. And so as long as your surfaces are tangent to each other, this tool can be really great. All right, so now let's talk about some of the disadvantages or limitations to using the emboss command. Number one, as you can see here, is that it's not going to wrap hard corners. All right, there's no tangent relationship between these two edges. So even though I've got this bevel detail, if I look at this from the front, that has been lost in this projection because there is a hard corner. So it's going to stop right there. It's going to roll around the other side, but it is going to stop at any hard corners. Now, that's not the most difficult thing to solve for unless you really need a hard corner. So for example, if I was to introduce a 0.25 inch fillet here, and then I re-emboss, select this as my sketch profile and suggest this is my face and hit OK. Now you can see I've captured this element. So if you can get away with using a small corner, that's going to allow you to finish that wrap. The next thing that is kind of tricky about the Emboss tool, as we can see, is there is some trial and error to it. All right. Now, if I, for example, am trying to get this right up to this edge and I'm projecting from this, unless I'm going to go through and do the math of this length plus the circumference of this corner plus the side of this, I'm going to just have to do some like clicking and dragging to try to get this edge to the right place. All right, so there is a little bit of trial and error involved with this Emboss tool because you're trying to figure out in real time what the tool is actually doing. You can see the same thing over here with the, I'm going to put a little bit of a pill shape here, a pill shape box. And so if I take this, you can see it from the front plane here, right? And then I wrap it around the corner, trying to figure out geometrically. This is pretty close because it's very close to this front face. You've only got a little bit of bend that it's got to account for. But once you get over to this side, I'm going to have to do some serious clicking and dragging to try to figure out how to get this thing where I want it in terms of terminating. But it is allowing me to do some really cool surface details, and because they're somewhat unconstrained, I'm able to update them pretty quickly. The next limitation that I want you to be thinking about is what I'm going to call the divergent distortion. So what I've got here to illustrate this is a circle projected onto the front of my cylinder. This is a fairly large circle, so let's look what happens when I deboss it into the surface. As you can see, just even looking at it from the front view here, it doesn't really look like a circle anymore, right? You can see this in the sketch. On the smaller one, it still looks pretty good, but as the circle gets bigger, we're starting to get some pretty big distortion as it's wrapping around that corner. I'm going to turn the sketch off so you can see it. And looking at this object, it's starting to look very ovular from the front view plane. If you really want to be looking straight at this thing and it look like a circle, that's something that you want to consider, or any other shape. You have to understand that as this thing is starting to curve, it is going to distort. Now, this is going to be particularly obvious on things like cylinders that have a very big kind of curvature to the surface, but anytime you've got objects that are wrapping on a surface or being embossed onto a surface, you do have to recognize that there is going to be some distortion there. All right, now the next thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to extend this up a little bit, is talk about the undercuts and normal projection. So what I've got here is I've got some text that's a little bit bigger. And what I want to show you is what's happening as I'm wrapping around this circle. All right, the first emboss was pretty shallow, right? So you probably can't see it, as embossings generally tend to be. But if I look at this from the top plane, I took this undercut and I embossed it out a little bit farther. If I look at this from the top plane, you can see here that all these surfaces are essentially being projected normal to the starting plane. If I was to lay that sketch on that plane and then project it out, it's going to extrude in a normal direction. So what are the disadvantages here? Well, number one, I want you to be thinking about if, for example, you were going to use this for 3D printing and you've got it set this way, you're going to need to potentially account for the fact that you're going to have some support material to deal with, and that might hinder the look of your text. It's also not going to work if you're going to try to CNC this or plastic injection mold it from this direction because you've got these undercuts here that your tooling is not going to be able to get around. All right, that's might be a little bit more complicated, but just something to think about as you continue your modeling journey, that there are going to be reasons why you don't want surfaces to be projected in the normal direction. You need all of your surfaces to be lined up one way. So that is going to transition us to the second technique you can use for creating emboss and deboss features, and that is our good old-fashioned extrude tool. So let's jump over to the other side of our object, and I'm going to show you how to do it. I've created another offset plane over here on the back side so that I can project sketches onto it or create sketches in it. And now what we've got is our embossed extrude text. So how does this work? All right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to edit this feature so you can see what I did. With the emboss command dialog popped up, you can see I've selected my text sketch, my two-dimensional sketch as the profile. And then for the start, I'm going to actually select my object. All right, so then for the object, I've selected this face here. Then what it's going to ask me for is the offset distance. How far am I going to offset it from this starting object? And I'm going to use 0.1. And I'm going to use join as my operation and hit OK. As you can see, for something like this, it actually looks very, very similar to what I've created over here in terms of the effect. And I'm going to show you how to do a deboss first, and then we'll talk about what's actually different and some of the advantages and disadvantages. But that's how you create an emboss feature. Next thing we're going to do is create a deboss feature. All right, so I've got another sketch here. All right, and let's bring up the extrude dialog box. I'm going to right click on that and click edit feature. And in this dialog box, what you can see, to create the deboss, I am going to use my sketch profile as the start plane, but I'm going to extend it up to my object. And then I'm going to create an offset negative from this face, so inside of that face, and I'm going to change my operation type to cut. All right, so you can see it's basically projecting that cutter up into the object, and then I'm going to hit OK, and that is going to create my debossed extruded feature into the surface. And again, this is going to, for very subtle curvatures, this is going to look almost identical to what we've created using the Deboss tool. So I wouldn't bring this up unless there were some clear differences, and so let's explain what those are. To really showcase this, let's go over to our circle or our cylinder here, all right? And I've got a new extruded text, and I'm going to use the same technique in the last one to extrude it onto the surface. All right, so let's look at this in comparison to our extruded text on the other side. So as you can see, they look pretty similar, except for one distinct detail. Remember, I talked to you about the directionality of this extrude and how it can be a problem in certain cases, particularly certain manufacturing methods. So in this situation, you've got the text being extruded essentially normal to the surface that it's sitting on, whereas in this situation, all of my text is aligned with the extrusion plane, right? Everything is moving in the same direction. Still achieves essentially the same look, but if you were doing some 3D printing where you want very clean text on the surface, either embossed or debossed, you would probably want to use this technique. Or if you're going to be using manufacturing methods like CNCing or plastic injection molding, then obviously you are going to want to use projected text instead of extruded text. But with that manufacturing advantages comes some disadvantages, and we're going to use the next sketch to talk about that. So I've got some slightly larger text here, and what we are going to talk about is fall off. When I go to emboss this text here, all right, you're going to see I've got some warnings, and that is because there is a miss. If I look at this from the front view, I don't have these arrows anymore because they are being projected right past this surface, okay? And as you can also see, their letters are starting to get really stretched out as they roll around this surface. And that has to do with the fundamental way that the program is handling an extrusion versus a emboss command. In an emboss command, we're doing what's essentially happening with the label, where it's unwrapping that surface, it's projecting the sketch, and then it's rewrapping it. In an extrusion, it's not doing that. If I open up this command dialog here and hit edit feature, it is projecting that straight into this cylinder. So as it starts to go around the curve, the projection has to go farther. All right, so you are going to start to get distortions in your letters as they start to wrap around the sides. They're going to look really, really good from the front view, but they are going to start to stretch as they roll versus these, which are being rolled with the surface. So for that reason, I generally try to keep extrusions, especially on something with such an extreme curvature as a cylinder, I try to keep my extrusions within around like the first third of the cylinder here. If I was to cut this in half and then cut this into 3 different pie slices, I try to keep it in the central third. Otherwise, you get a little bit too much distortion, or you run the risk of actually missing the sketch entirely. Now, let's take that same example and let's talk about our circle. So with my circle here, I'm going to use the exact same size circles as I did in the last example, but here, let's go ahead and extrude this. I've got to take my grip lines and move them back out of the way. So what we can see with the circle is that when we're looking at it from the front view, it's very hard to see because it's so perfect, that circle is going to look perfectly circular. You are going to get a clear projection straight onto our surface. So it looks very well preserved on the front view, but you are going to notice as we roll, we're starting to get more of that Pringle effect. It's starting to stretch out from the other views. So I hope this text and this circle have helped you to understand that there are advantages and disadvantages to both techniques depending on what's more important. If it's more important to preserve the look of the text from the front view, then you're going to go with a projection. If it's more important to be able to wrap the surface well, then you are going to want to go with an emboss. All right, so getting close to the end here, but a couple more things that I want to talk about. When we look at the grip lines, for example, that is not really a feature that you are going to be able to get with the projection command, right? Anytime, if I try to project these lines and wrap them around this surface, it's just not going to happen with an extrude command. If I look at this command here and I go to project it, it just wants to go straight. In fact, I can't even extend it up to an object. If I do, it's going to give me an error. It's too extreme for the program to figure out in that manner. So if you want to create grip lines like this, which are going to be cleaner for a 3D printing, you can go like this. If you want something that actually wraps around your surface a little bit better, then you might want to use an emboss command. There are other techniques for doing this as well, but they're outside of the scope of this video. And then lastly, another advantage of another advantage of using the extrude technique versus the emboss technique is that you do have more control over the positioning. For example, if I've got this knob, for example, let me say that I've got this complex surface, but I'm going to need to put a circular knob in the middle of it. And I want to create an embossed outline or something like that. And I need to make sure that the center of this circle is positioned perfectly on the edge of this face. I can do that with an extrusion. And I know that from the front view, I'm going to have a perfectly round circle embossed detail from the front view, which I'm not going to be able to get using the emboss technique. All right, so as we start to wind down this video, I just want to do a quick summary of what we've talked about. We've reviewed the emboss command and the extrusion command for creating a range of emboss and deboss style effects. I encourage you to experiment with both and to integrate both of them into your 3D modeling toolkit. As you continue to develop as a 3D modeler, you are going to find situations where the emboss technique is going to work, and there are going to be situations where the extrude technique is more appropriate. So you want to make sure that you familiarize yourself with both. And with that, I am going to wrap up today's video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you found it helpful in understanding these concepts. If you did, hit the like button. If you had any questions or topics that you'd like to see in future videos, leave those in the comments below. And as always, hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date as I release new content. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one. And don't forget to hit save.